Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Sachin Karnik here. Today is the 6th of February, 2025. We're, con- we're continuing our religious studies exploration, and there was a request made from one of our participants last time to cover the question of suffering with regards to the religious traditions of the world. So, as we have been saying in the Judeo Christian tradition, one of the main causes of human suffering would be the fall. I mean, this is the ontological idea. The ontological idea in a monotheistic religion is that there is the supreme Lord, the supreme being, the supreme God, and then there's all the created beings. This is Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc. Monotheism, pure monotheism, has this type of ontology that there is God, and then there's obedience to God, and if you disobey, there's a problem. It almost sounds a bit simplistic, but that's the basic idea. And then the goal is to obey, to come in communion with, to come in harmony with, to come in obedience with, etc. Like even Jesus said, if you believe in me, obey me. So it's about obedience. It's a very dualistic approach. So that's the basic idea here in terms of why suffering is there. We have already talked about this before, that the forbidden fruit was eaten in Genesis, and then that's the cause of suffering, the knowledge of good and evil. You open the dimension into a reality, which is this material world. Maybe that's the way to think about it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is there. There's the tree of life that's there, and then there's the cherubim that are there. These are the guardians of that tree, so no one can enter inside there because they've fallen into the material world that was forbidden. It's a disconnection with God, things like that. This is the story, right? So is the story to be taken literally? If you want to take it that way, people have done interpretations of that based on their own traditions. It's possible to interpret the whole thing in an allegorical way or some type of a didactic way or something like that. There's many ways that so many have interpreted these ideas from the Bible, for example. So this is the basic idea. Now, in Christianity, there is a very basic concept that Christ died for everybody's sins. So there's the concept of sin. So sin is an affront against God. That's what that is. So in some sense, the forbidden fruit is a sinful act because that was not to be eaten. If you eat that, then there's a problem there. Why is it a sinful act? Because it opens the doorway into this other world. And then look at the experience, human experience. There's hatred, there's violence, there's suffering of all kinds. If you were to make a list of the type of suffering that's there, it's absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. You're talking about, layers and layers of suffering, layers and layers. The list is probably near endless. That's how it is. There's emotional suffering, physical suffering, existential suffering. There's just all categories upon categories, illness and aging and discomforts and diseases. And, I may have told you this before. At one point, I downloaded a whole series of articles on the entire list of diseases and illnesses. I couldn't even get to the end of it. It could be in the hundreds of thousands. It's incredible. Even in medical science, what's out there in terms of the number of illnesses, diseases, injuries, deformations, and all kinds of things, things that we have never even heard of. Why does that exist? So this raises a lot of questions. Now, purely from a Judeo-Christian perspective, the goal here is to recommune with God. In Christianity, it is through Jesus, and Judaism is through maybe the prophets or the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, and that's how you would gain liberation. That's the basic idea. Now, what about the other traditions? Now, these other traditions are a little bit more difficult to unravel. Particularly if you look at something like Buddhism, just as a quick review, the word is Buddha. We say in English, we say Buddha and all that. Those are our ways of pronouncing that. But the word is actually pronounced Buddha. And all that word means is that the buddhi, meaning the intelligence, the Sanskrit word, is awakened. It's the awakening of intelligence. That is called Buddha, meaning one whose intelligence is awakened. Such a person is called a Buddha. That's all. It wasn't the name of that individual that's called the Buddha. And so the goal there is to reach a state of nirvana in Buddhism. Buddhism came later on. I mean, that's the development of the tradition. But it has to do with recognizing the noble truth that life is suffering. Now, the Buddha didn't explain why there is suffering or is there a God. He never talked about God. He never mentioned God at all. So he didn't say there isn't God. I mean, that idea came later on in Buddhism, but there is no notion of God or even a divine spark or soul like there is in many of the Hindu traditions. That's not there in Buddhism. So in many ways, Buddhism is a totally atheistic tradition. The tradition is atheistic. Even the people are praying to the Buddha and all that, sometimes they just don't realize that the Buddha himself said, if you see me in your meditations, just cut me out of your meditation. He even said that. So he was totally against this notion of any form of God or anything like that. He was just about pure awareness. Just be aware of the mind, be free of it, and you go into nothingness. Nirvana is nothing. He didn't describe if there is something. Again, this is a very intricate subject, but in simple language, that's what it means. So Buddhism is atheistic. There's no monotheistic God in Buddhism at all. People who think that, they're totally wrong. That's not true. All right, so that is the Eightfold Path is there to reach nirvana. The Four Noble Truths are about the ending of suffering. And then there are multiple denominations in Buddhism that have developed. There's all different forms, but their goal is only one, to reach that state of nirvana. The word nirvana means that there is no experience of any kind, that one is freed from the cycle of birth and death. Now, you'll see there's a big difference here in terms of the Abrahamic religions and many of the Eastern traditions. One of the key historical differences is the belief in reincarnation, the cycle of birth and death. Almost all denominations of Hinduism and every denomination of Buddhism accept the cycle of birth and death. Jainism, Sikhism, Buddhism, all the different, there's hundreds of denominations in the Vedic tradition, which is called Hinduism. So what they say is that the suffering is because of the cycle of birth and death. So in the Gita, for example, or in other scriptures from India, they talked about this reincarnation cycle, that there is a soul, not the way the word soul is used in the Abrahamic traditions. So just be careful about the language. But there's a soul, it is consciousness, it is the same substance as the ultimate reality, Brahman, or the divine. It's exactly the same in terms of its substance, but one is within ignorance. One, and the higher reality, the ultimate reality, is beyond ignorance, beyond illusion, beyond delusion, beyond any kind of division. That is the vast, infinite, one without a second consciousness. That is called Brahman. So if you're keeping track of the terminology, the word Brahman, Brahman, Brahma or Brahman, you can pronounce it either way. And there's other synonyms for that also. There's a lot of Sanskrit terminology, and I don't want to go too much into it because it's just, we can get tangled up in that. But it basically means vast, unending reality. So the rishis, the seers from thousands of years back, 10,000 plus years back in India, they came upon this vast reality in their meditations, or by grace, however you want to. They talk about grace also. But they don't use the word God, not in the theistic, monotheistic sense. There are gods that are talked about, the wind god, the sun god, and all that kind of stuff. But there isn't really in the original ancient Indian tradition, Hindu tradition, the Vedic tradition, a concept of a monotheistic God as such. Although there are some interpretations like that, there really isn't a clear-cut statement like that, like in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible, that there's an Elohim, a great king of all kings who is sitting on a throne and is judging and is giving judgment, and you have to worship him. That notion isn't so explicit in the ancient scriptures of India, the Upanishads, etc. That's not really there. What is there is emphasis on realizing who you are. Realize who you are, the subject. And when you realize who you realize you are that. Tat tvam asi. Sanskrit language again. Tat means that thou art. And because of not realizing that, somehow this is the cause of suffering. So the cause of suffering in the Vedic tradition, and I know this terminology is difficult to understand, but we're going to cover Hinduism in a lot of detail, probably 2 years from now. But I'm going to mix in stuff, so don't worry about it. You'll get a mixture of it all. The Vedic tradition means coming from the Vedas. So the Vedas are four, and there are four classifications. And then the end portion of the Veda is called the Vedanta or Upanishads. And so that is where this higher knowledge about the ultimate reality is presented there. And the basic concept is that there's one vast, unending, one without a second reality. Everything is only that. There's none other than that. That is called the non-dualistic interpretation. So what is the cause of suffering? Not realizing that you are the infinite. That's why we suffer. That's why there's a body. That's why there's reincarnation. That's why there's the material world. And you might see an interconnection there with regards to these trees these tree analogies, that there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that could be interpreted as falling into duality. Many people interpret it that way from the Eastern traditions, that is the birth of duality, when the soul, which is just like God, I mean, the interpretation on the Eastern side would be Adam, Eve, or whatever the beings are that exist in communion or nothing but that same divinity. It comes into duality. Again, it's a very intricate discussion, but the cause of the suffering is lack of realization who we are. We think we are mind, body, our desires, etc. That's not who we are. That's what the Eastern, the non-dualists would say. They would say that, no, that's not who you are. You don't know who you are. It's not just knowledge, it's realization. Realize thyself. Realize exactly what you are, who you are, what you are. And and in that realization, there is freedom. Even though the body continues, the body is not who you are. Body is just a wave on the ocean. It's the wave is not separate from the ocean, but when we think that the wave is separate from the ocean, where the trouble begins. The wave comes and goes. Bodies come and go. So in reality, in the non-dualistic tradition, there is that notion that there is the one supreme reality only. Nothing other than that exists. And that is who you are. You are that. So it's kind of blasphemous in the Abrahamic tradition to say you are God. So again, this word God is not used in the Eastern tradition. Let's be very careful about the language. They use a different word called Brahman. There is a word that translates to God. And there are many words like that, but that's in the theistic developments of Hinduism. Okay, so we'll talk about that some other time. The point is that if there is only one and you are that, then realize it. So the concept of guru comes into the picture. Guru. This is a common word. What does that word mean? If you're taking notes, you can write this down also. Gu means darkness. Ru means light. Very simple. Gu means that which is binding, that which is bondage, that which is ignorance, that which is lack of realization, mistaken realization, superimposition, all sorts of ideas. That is called Gu. And Ru means enlightenment, realization of what you are, who you are. That is what the word guru means. You see, so the nutshell of this entire 10,000 plus history in India, which would include Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism, is the notion of guru. That is there throughout, except for a few teachers who have discounted that idea. But there is the guru, and there are the disciples, and there is the shishya. They're called. They're who are trying to learn, to awaken to the same reality. You see, so what is the cause of suffering from Hinduism point of view? Lack of realization who you are. So then one goes into the cycle of rebirth. The cycle of rebirth is extensively described in many scriptures, and they have the rishis from that time, the sages from that time, in their meditative realizations, they came upon this type of realization that there are 8.4 million species that they identified. They categorized them into 4 parts, and that the soul, called the jiva, Jiva, is transmigrating from one to another based on level of consciousness, psychological consciousness. And to get a human body is considered to be very rare. If a human body is obtained, then that is the opportunity to do all the spiritual practices, to come back and realize who you actually are. Or another way to think about it in a more dualistic sense, to worship God without any kind of division or breakage, like a continuous worship of the Supreme, but that is in the more devotional strands of Hinduism. And you will see there's actually a lot of similarity in the devotional practices and strands of Hinduism and the Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic tradition. There's actually a lot of similarity because it's dualistic worship. Buddhism really doesn't have any dualistic worship. Although people worship the Buddha and all, they use the same kind of Hindu rituals to worship the Buddha. You'll see all kinds of temples, Buddhist temples and all that. But that came much later on. That was developed because people need some way to kind of progress further. But there's no notion of worshiping anybody inside Buddhism, or any founder or teacher or anything. The notion is that you awaken, and the Buddhist teachings are there to awaken. So that's that tradition. And then of course you also have Taoism, which we haven't talked about at all. But there's Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and then there's Shintoism and all the Zen and all that. There's lots of different variations of all these things, right? So the cause of suffering, many causes. Religious language, religious traditions look at it that way. Now, there's some problems here also, because we have limited time. I'll just try to point it out. This is called the problem of evil, the problem of suffering in the Abrahamic traditions. And even the same kind of question is there in the Eastern traditions. Why is there any suffering? If we say that there's God who is benevolent, omnibenevolent, who is all compassion, all grace, and he's created this forbidden tree because only God could have created the forbidden tree. See the problem here. If God created the forbidden tree and he's omniscient, he knows everything, that he knew that they're going to eat from that tree. He already knew that. So then why did he forbid it? That means that, so that means what? That God is not compassionate. He knows this is going to happen. And even if it did, if it happened through disobedience, why doesn't God, using his power, just liberate everybody? Why continue the suffering? So that would be indicative. That could be indicative of some of the problems that exist in theodicy. So so there's theodicy, there's theology, there is there's also the way salvation occurs, but there's deep metaphysics behind this. So if you remember that these stories in the Old Testament, New Testament, other traditions, in Sachin's humble interpretation, there's 5 aspects to these. So there is the didactic, there is the metaphorical, metaphysical, didactic, they're historical, and experiential. So every one of these stories or doctrines or whatever they are in any tradition of the world, in my last 25, 30 years of study of all of these different areas, I have tried to extract it and put it in a way that can be understood by anybody, and that's these 5 components. So these 5 components are talking about these basic aspects of these stories. Is it just a story, or is there really some truth behind it? Is there some history behind it? What is it that is behind it? And that is the big question. So is there an omnibenevolent God? If so, then how can there be such level of wars and suffering, like concentration camps and evil people coming and all of this horrific stuff that is going on? Is God not omnibenevolent? Why doesn't he stop it? There's babies that are born crippled. And by the way, in the 3 Abrahamic traditions, there is no doctrine of reincarnation that is really traditionally described. So there may have been in some offshoot, more mystical traditions, they may have talked about reincarnation. I don't know about that exactly. Maybe it's not very clear. You see, so if God is there, why he doesn't stop all this terrible pain? Even an ordinary human being can see that all this terrible things should not be there. So even ordinary human being has much more compassion than even this so-called God. This is the atheistic argument. Those who are atheists, they argue this way. And I'm not promoting that or discounting it or anything. It's just you decide what you want to believe. It's up to you. But the atheistic argument is of this type. It is of this type that states that if there is an omnibenevolent, omniscient, and all good God, this terrible suffering should never exist. You could stop it and put everybody into heaven or liberate everybody out of this. Why is there any suffering at all? But again, the Genesis answer is that there's this forbidden fruit or whatever that analogy is. whatever it is, it may be very mystical, very, very metaphysical that we don't understand, or there's a lot of theological interpretation, but none of it may be satisfying to any, there's all kinds of answers. Some of them may be satisfying, some of them may not be. One would have to go into the depth of theology to unravel and unpack that. But you see the trouble. The basic problem is that if there is an omnibenevolent God, how can there be all of this terrible pain and suffering? Or it would be that the God cannot stop it. Then that would mean he's not omnipotent then. Then that means there's a problem there. So if you say that God is omnipotent, can do everything, then he should be able to stop all these horrific things. It's like that are there. There are people who were crucified. I mean, Jesus was crucified. I'm talking about people who were, people have been burnt and people have been killed, and there's natural calamities, tornadoes and hurricanes. Look at this current war that just happened in the Middle East. And it's been going on like that for, wars and suffering. But God cannot stop all that? Now, you see, so that's the objection from the atheistic side. So atheism, and there's something called, what is called like more affirmative atheism, or it's called positive atheism. Positive atheism means that it's a denial of the existence of God. That's called positive atheism. And in philosophy of religion, negative atheism is called agnosticism. You're not sure. Maybe God exists, maybe it doesn't exist. It's agnostic arguments. That's agnosticism. If you're taking notes, agnosticism is also called negative atheism. And positive atheism is a denial of God. It's not simply, well, I don't know if God exists or not. It's those who say that it doesn't exist for all these reasons. And they have hundreds of reasons. So there is a whole society in United States, American Society of Atheists or something. Many societies are there. You see, that absolutely deny the existence of God. That this is a fabricated, man-made phenomena. There's nothing like that, actually. This is what the atheists say. Now let's compare with the Eastern tradition for a moment. The notion of consciousness. Well, what is consciousness? So say the Brahman. What is that? And how does that differ from nirvana? So again, the Buddha talked about nirvana. He didn't talk about Brahman. He didn't talk about a vast consciousness. He said there's nothing. There is not. Your goal is to get into nothingness, of self-oblivion, that you are not even there now. You're just a bundle of different mental impressions. You're caught in that, or somehow their impressions are caught within themselves. There's no you that is caught in that. And once that thing ends, the cycle of birth and death ends, and that is liberation, you're into a vast, unending void, V-O-I-D. It is called Shunya, S-H-U-N-Y-A. It's called Shunyatavad. That is the philosophy of Buddhism, the doctrine of nothingness. There's no question of God there. There's no question of anything existing there. There's no material world there. There's just total nothingness. You see, and that's the end, and right there. There's absolutely the end. That is the goal. That is how the Buddhists describe this thing. Now that differs from the theory of consciousness in the Vedic tradition, Vedanta tradition, that there is actually divinity. Again, this is a Western word, but there is the substratum of all existence, truth, consciousness, bliss. It is called Sat, Chit, Ananda. That these three aspects are there, and that is the unending substratum. That is the only thing that exists. So there is something that exists. It's not nothingness. There is only the existence of consciousness and nothing other than that. Because we're conscious, and if you keep probing it through path of inquiry and so many other ways, you've discovered that is who you are. This is the non-dualistic idea, and I'm just presenting only that aspect of it right now. Now, in the non-dualistic idea, they have a problem there also. If the one is manifesting as the many, or dreaming the many, if that's the case, why is there pain, suffering, evil, problems, this and that? Are you saying that supreme consciousness, which is undiluted, pure, absolute, has degraded into the many with all the problems and the diversities of the world? If there's only one, which is the basic theory, how can there be many? Why is there even many? And if there's many, where did the many come from? And why is there all this conflict and trouble and this and that? Why? Because if there's only the one, that means that one is also the many. So, and if you say that the one has become the many, then that means the one has come back into ignorance and suffering. That one supreme consciousness has degraded itself into that. But the non-dualistic tradition said, no, it has not degraded. It remains as it is. Then what is this? No answer. Very difficult. They don't really give any answer. That's a big problem on the non-dualistic side. If you ask them about really try to pin them down, they'll come up with you know what the answer that they give? They give the answer is this is a wrong question. They eliminate the question. They say that you're asking this question out of ignorance. You just realize who you are, the question disappears. Well, maybe. I mean, maybe, who knows, right? It's like asking, why does darkness exist? You know, like a 7, 8, 9-year-old child says, you know, wow, it's dark. Get rid of this darkness. Where does it? Well, does it really exist? It isn't actually. Its existence, or it seems like there's something dark there, but it's a lack of light. When the sunlight is there, there's no concept of darkness. Where the sun is there any concept of day and night or darkness or anything? So non-dualists will say that realize the reality. Once you realize that this is not even there, the world is not even there actually. There's only the one that is reflecting as the many. So it's in the lack of realization that the suffering and problems and difficulties are. In the realization, all these questions disappear. All the questions disappear. The intellect is transcended. The experiences come and go, but those experiences are still only the one. Isn't that interesting? What an idea. What an idea. You know, so the multiplicity is nothing but reflection. So, and a simple analogy would be if you have 100 clay pots of water with all different amounts of water, and maybe there's different substances in there or something, who knows, but it's all water. And the sun is reflected. Are there 100 suns in there? There's only one sun that is reflecting in the 100 pots, but each pot thinks I'm something different. This is the ego, the birth of the ego. We talked about it last time. So they say that's an illusion too. The non-dualist will say that's an illusion. You know, there's a much more theological interpretation on the Western side about where this ego comes from. The ego comes from this disobedience with God. That's the simple answer. You know, but in the Eastern tradition, this ego is a mysterious phenomena. Some of the greatest Advaitic, the non-dualistic teachers have not really answered where that comes. They said that the question is wrong. They keep coming back to that this question will disappear. You know, you realize who you are, realize what you are. And I am at 7:30 here. Right on time, folks. So let's stop here for now before we want to pull our hair out, right? Okay, and then I'd love to entertain some comments and questions or whatever.